Some jobs are just plain dangerous. You know the kind, the ones where a single misstep, a moment of inattention, can change everything forever. But then there are jobs that exist on another level of risk entirely, where the danger isn't something you can easily see, hear, or smell. On the cold, quiet night of January 3rd, 1961, out in the vast, empty expanse of the Idaho desert, such a job went catastrophically wrong. At the National Reactor Testing Station, inside a nondescript steel building known as ARA 602, the stationary low-power reactor number 1, or SL-1, was about to make history for all the wrong reasons. This wasn't a job in a coal mine or on a crab boat. This was the cutting edge of the atomic age. At precisely 9:01 p.m., the silence of the winter night was shattered. An alarm blared across the facility, a piercing sound that signaled something had gone terribly wrong inside the reactor building. At first, some might have dismissed it. False alarms weren't unheard of. In fact, a couple had gone off earlier that very day. But this was different. This was the real deal. Inside that thin-walled structure, an event of unimaginable power had just unfolded in less time than it takes to blink. America's first and only fatal nuclear reactor accident had just occurred, and the lives of 3 men, along with the nation's confidence in its nuclear programs, were instantly and violently altered. The SL-1 was an experimental project, part of the Army's ambitious plan to develop small, portable nuclear reactors. The idea was to power remote Cold War installations like radar stations in the Arctic, without needing a constant supply of fossil fuels. It was a novel concept designed to be operated by a small crew of trained military personnel. The men working there weren't just soldiers. They were pioneers at the forefront of a new and powerful technology. They were tasked with a job that few understood, in a place far from the public eye, managing the very building blocks of the universe to generate power in the middle of nowhere. That night, the reactor was being brought back online after an 11-day shutdown for the Christmas holiday. It was a routine procedure, something the crew had done before. But hidden within the complex machinery and the powerful core was a combination of design flaws and operational pressures that had set a deadly trap. The alarm that screeched through the cold Idaho air was more than a warning. It was a final, desperate cry from a machine that had been pushed beyond its limits. The story of what happened next is a tough one, a stark reminder that even the most brilliant innovations carry immense risks, and that the people who do these jobs are the ones who pay the price when things go south. When you look at the heart of any job, especially a dangerous one, you find the people, the ones who show up, punch the clock, and get it done. On that fateful night at the SL-1 facility, the crew consisted of 3 such men. They were young, dedicated, and entrusted with a massive responsibility. The shift supervisor was Richard C. Dick Legg, a 26-year-old Navy Seabee with a reputation for being a stickler for the rules. He was the man in charge, the one who knew the reactor systems and was responsible for overseeing the complex startup procedure. He was standing where the job required him to be, right on top of the reactor vessel itself. Working alongside him was Army Specialist John A. Burns, who was only 22 years old. He was the one tasked with the hands-on part of the job that night, the operator who would physically manipulate the reactor's controls. By all accounts, he was a capable technician, but he was also a young man with a life outside the reactor building. There were whispers and rumors later, tales of personal troubles, but on that night, he was a soldier doing a highly specialized and demanding job. His role was critical, requiring a steady hand and a focused mind, as he was the one who would reconnect the most important control rod to its drive mechanism. The third man on the floor was Army Specialist Richard Leroy McKinley, a 27-year-old trainee. He was there to learn, to watch the experienced crew and gain the skills he would need to one day operate the reactor himself. He was standing a short distance away, observing the procedure and getting a feel for the flow of the work. For him, it was another night of on-the-job training in a field that promised a future at the forefront of technology. He was a husband and a father, learning a trade that was as mysterious as it was groundbreaking, completely unaware that his training shift would be his last. These 3 men, Legg, Burns, and McKinley, formed the team responsible for one of the most powerful devices ever created by humankind. They weren't famous scientists or high-ranking generals. They were enlisted men, technicians doing a job that most people couldn't even imagine. They were the human element in a world of humming machinery and invisible forces. Their story is a sobering look at the real-world consequences of pushing boundaries, and a tribute to the workers who are often the unsung heroes, and sometimes the tragic victims, of technological progress. Their names are forever linked to this event, a stark reminder of the human cost of a dirty job. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand the job they were doing. The reactor was controlled by 5 rods made of a material that absorbs neutrons, the tiny particles that drive a nuclear chain reaction. When the rods were lowered into the reactor's core, they soaked up the neutrons and kept things quiet. To start the reactor, you had to pull them out, just a little bit at a time. The most important of these was the central control rod, number 9. It had so much influence that pulling it out just a few inches was enough to get the reactor going. The procedure that night required reconnecting this rod to its automated motor, a task that meant manually lifting it by hand. The manual specified that rod number 9 should be lifted no more than 4 inches. That was the magic number, the safe limit. Anything more, and you were rolling the dice with physics. The design of the SL-1 was so sensitive that this single central rod had enough power to bring the reactor to a critical state all by itself. On the night of January 3rd, the job fell to John Burns. He was the one who had to lift the 84-pound rod and attach it to the drive mechanism. It was a task that required precision and a delicate touch, a strange mix of brute force and intricate work in a place where mistakes were not an option. For reasons we will never truly know, something went terribly wrong. Instead of lifting the rod 4 inches, Burns pulled it out approximately 20 inches, 5 times the safe distance. Some theories suggest the rod might have gotten stuck due to corrosion or warping, a known issue with the reactor, and then came free with a sudden jerk. Others have speculated about personal issues or even a moment of intentional rebellion, though no evidence has ever confirmed this. Whatever the reason, a sticky mechanism, a moment of distraction, a tragic misjudgment, the result was the same. The one action that was never supposed to happen, happened. In that single fluid motion, the heart of the reactor was completely unrestrained. With the main control rod yanked out of the core, the neutron population exploded. The delicate balance that keeps a nuclear reactor stable was shattered in an instant. The chain reaction didn't just start, it went into overdrive. The technical term is prompt critical, which is a clinical way of saying all hell broke loose. The power of the atom, which had been carefully managed and controlled, was now completely, terrifyingly, and disastrously unleashed. The 4-inch margin of safety had been breached, and the consequences would be measured in milliseconds. The instant the control rod was pulled too far, the reactor's power level skyrocketed. In just 4 milliseconds, a fraction of the time it takes to snap your fingers, the reactor's output surged from a gentle hum to an unbelievable 20 gigawatts. That's nearly 7,000 times its designed maximum power. The massive amount of energy was dumped directly into the reactor's core, and the water surrounding the fuel plates flash-boiled into steam. It wasn't a chemical explosion like dynamite. It was a physical one, a steam explosion of immense and brutal force, driven by the raw power of nuclear fission. The pressure inside the reactor vessel went from normal to over 650 times the pressure of our atmosphere. The result of this incredible pressure spike was violent beyond imagination. The entire 26,000-pound reactor vessel, a massive steel container, was launched upwards. It jumped 9 feet into the air, slamming into the ceiling of the building before crashing back down into its original position. The force of the blast ripped the reactor apart from the inside. Shielding plugs, heavy metal cylinders designed to block radiation, were shot out of the top of the reactor like cannonballs. The room was instantly filled with a lethal spray of superheated radioactive water and metal fragments, turning the workspace into an unsurvivable environment. For the 3 men on the reactor floor, the event was instantaneous and devastating. Richard Legg, the supervisor standing directly on top of the reactor, was in the worst possible place. One of the ejected shield plugs, a piece of steel, weighing hundreds of pounds, shot out of the reactor and impaled him, pinning his body to the ceiling of the building. John Burns, who had pulled the rod, was thrown across the room with such force that he was slammed against a concrete wall. The blast and the immediate overwhelming wave of radiation gave him no chance of survival. Richard McKinley, the trainee, was standing further away, but he was not spared. He was struck by flying debris and caught in the same invisible deadly wave of radiation that filled the room. The blast itself inflicted fatal injuries, but the radiation dose he received was so massive that it would have been lethal on its own, many times over. In those few milliseconds, the job had ended in the most violent way possible. The reactor room, once a place of controlled power, had become a contaminated, chaotic tomb, and the three men who had been tasked with its operation were now victims of its catastrophic failure. To really get why this happened, you have to look at the machine itself. The SL-1 wasn't like the giant commercial power plants we think of today. It was an experimental military reactor built on a tight schedule during the Cold War. The main goal was to make it small and simple enough to be transported to remote locations and run by a handful of soldiers. This design for convenience approach led to some serious compromises in safety. The reactor's core was packed with a large amount of highly enriched uranium. Actually more than what was in the Hiroshima bomb, so it could run for 3 years without refueling. This made the core extremely reactive and sensitive. One of the biggest flaws was in the control rod system. Most reactors have dozens of control rods, so the effect of any single rod is small. The SL-1, in its quest for simplicity, had only 5. This design meant that the central rod, number 9, was incredibly powerful. In fact, it was so powerful that withdrawing it completely could, all by itself, cause the reactor to go prompt critical. This is a design flaw that modern engineers would call a nightmare. It violated a fundamental principle of reactor safety. No single component should be capable of causing a catastrophic failure. The fate of the entire reactor rested on the precise handling of one single rod. To make matters worse, the reactor had a history of problems. To help control the highly reactive core, engineers had added strips of boron, a burnable poison, to the fuel assemblies. But these strips were a new, untested addition. Over time, they began to corrode and flake off, causing the control rods to get stuck in their channels. In the 2 years leading up to the accident, the rods had jammed or gotten stuck more than 80 times. The crew had to develop procedures for freeing them, which sometimes involved using force. This history of sticking rods is what fuels the theory that Burns was trying to unjam the rod when he pulled it too far. Finally, there was the building itself. The reactor was housed in a simple, unsealed steel building that looked a bit like a grain silo. It was designed to protect the reactor from the weather, not to contain an explosion or a release of radiation. There was no thick concrete containment dome like you see on modern power plants. The shielding for the workers was also minimal, consisting of movable lead blocks. During routine maintenance, workers were exposed to radiation levels that were high, even by the standards of the day. The entire setup, the sensitive core, the overpowered control rod, the history of mechanical issues, and the flimsy containment, created a perfect storm waiting for a single spark. When the alarm went off at 9:01 p.m., the first people to respond were the fire department and security personnel from the testing station. Driving through the dark, snowy landscape, they really had no idea what they were walking into. Their initial thought was that it was just another false alarm, but as they approached the SL-1 site, their radiation detectors started screaming. The first readings taken from a distance were 25 roentgens per hour, a dangerously high level. Realizing this was no drill, they backed off and called for health physicists, the experts in radiation safety. The job had just shifted from a routine alarm call to a full-blown radiological emergency. A second team of responders, equipped with a detector that could measure higher levels of radiation, made another approach. Their meter maxed out at 500 roentgens per hour, which is an absolutely lethal dose in a short amount of time. It was clear that something terrible had happened inside that building. Despite the incredible danger, the priority was to determine if anyone was still alive. A rescue attempt had to be made. Around 10:30 p.m., a team of volunteers suited up, took a deep breath, and prepared to enter a space where the invisible danger was literally off the charts. Their job was to run in, assess the situation, and get out as fast as possible. Inside, the scene was just one of utter devastation. The air was thick with radioactive dust, and the radiation levels were so high that every second counted. The responders quickly found 2 of the men. Richard McKinley was alive, but barely. He was moaning and twitching, severely injured from the blast. They saw John Burns nearby, clearly deceased. The team made the difficult decision to focus on the man who still showed signs of life. They carried McKinley out of the building and into a waiting ambulance, a heroic effort under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Sadly, he passed away before the ambulance could even reach the main highway. The initial searchers hadn't seen the third man, Richard Legg. It wasn't until a second team went in that they made the grim discovery. Looking up, they saw his body impaled on the ceiling, directly above the mangled reactor vessel. This area was the hotspot, with radiation fields measuring up to 1,000 Roentgens per hour. It was an unsurvivable zone. The responders had risked their own lives, entering an environment more hazardous than a battlefield, to try and save their comrades. Their bravery in the face of an unseen enemy stands as a testament to the character of the people who do these dirty, dangerous jobs. With one man evacuated and 2 confirmed deceased inside the reactor building, the mission shifted from rescue to recovery. But this was no ordinary recovery operation. The bodies of John Burns and Richard Legg were in a highly contaminated area, and the radiation levels were so intense that any prolonged exposure would be fatal. The job of retrieving them would require a level of planning and courage that was completely unprecedented. Every step had to be carefully choreographed to minimize the lethal dose of radiation that the recovery teams would absorb. It was a race against an invisible clock. The body of John Burns was recovered first, on January 4th, the day after the accident. A team of volunteers worked in relays, dashing into the building for just a few moments at a time to prepare his body for removal. They managed to place him on a stretcher and bring him out. A grim and hazardous task. But the recovery of Richard Legg was a far greater challenge. His body was pinned to the ceiling, 9 feet above the most radioactive spot on the entire site. Getting to him would require a completely different approach, one that balanced the need for dignity with the stark reality of self-preservation. For nearly a week, teams of engineers and health physicists worked to devise a plan. They decided the only way to reach Legg's body was from above. They used a large crane to suspend a specially constructed stretcher and platform. Teams of men, working in rotations that lasted only 65 seconds each, were lifted to the opening in the roof above the reactor room. In their brief window of time, they had to work quickly to dislodge the body from the shield plug that had impaled it and secure it to the stretcher. Each man who participated in this effort absorbed a significant radiation dose, knowingly sacrificing a piece of their own health to bring their colleague home. Finally, on January 9th, 6 days after the accident, they succeeded. Richard Legg's body was carefully lowered from the ceiling and removed from the building. The recovery effort was a masterpiece of grim ingenuity and raw courage. It was a job that required men to run toward a danger they couldn't see, armed only with a stopwatch and a sense of duty. The recovery of these men was one of the most difficult and dangerous jobs imaginable. A somber chapter in the history of nuclear energy that highlights the extreme lengths people will go to for their fallen comrades. The tragedy of the SL-1 accident didn't end with the recovery of the men. The intense radiation they had been exposed to had contaminated their bodies to an extreme degree. This created another heartbreaking and difficult job, preparing them for burial. The remains were so radioactive that a normal funeral was impossible. The health physicists and morticians faced the grim task of ensuring that the men could be laid to rest without posing a danger to the living. It was a final, sad testament to the invisible violence they had endured in their last moments. Each man's body was prepared with the utmost care, but under conditions that were more like a hazardous waste disposal than a funeral preparation. They were placed in lead-lined caskets, which were then sealed shut. These caskets were, in turn, placed inside heavy metal vaults. As a final precaution, the vaults were completely filled with concrete before being sealed. This multi-layered containment was necessary to shield the outside world from the radiation that would continue to emanate from their remains for years to come. It was a lonely and isolating end for men who had been part of a close-knit team. Even the personal effects of the men were too contaminated to be returned to their families. Their wedding rings, wallets, and watches had absorbed so much radiation that they had to be buried as radioactive waste. For the grieving families, this was another cruel blow. They were denied not only a normal farewell but also the small, tangible reminders of their loved ones. The ambulance that had carried Richard McKinley from the scene was so contaminated that it was driven out into the desert and abandoned for several hours before being decontaminated and eventually buried as waste itself. The burials were conducted with military honors, but they were unlike any other. The graves had to be specially prepared, with concrete lining the bottom to ensure long-term containment. The story of their final journey home is a powerful reminder that the consequences of a nuclear accident are profound and long-lasting. It's a dirty job to bury a hero, but it's another thing entirely when the hero himself has become a source of invisible danger. The meticulous and somber process of their burial underscores the awesome and terrifying power they were working with, and the permanent mark it left on them. In the aftermath of the SL-1 disaster, the questions came fast and hard. How could this have happened? Who was to blame? The investigation could never definitively determine the exact reason why John Burns pulled the rod so far. Was it a stuck mechanism that suddenly broke free? Was it a moment of human error? Or was it something else? While the true cause remains buried with the men, the investigation uncovered a cascade of systemic failures in the reactor's design, maintenance procedures, and operational oversight. The accident wasn't the result of one mistake, but the culmination of many small ones. The most immediate consequence was the end of the Army's portable nuclear power program. The dream of dotting the Arctic with small, easily operated reactors died that night in the Idaho desert. The risks were simply too great, the potential for disaster too severe. The SL-1 accident served as a brutal wake-up call for the entire nuclear industry, which at the time was still in its infancy. It was a harsh lesson that you can't cut corners when you're dealing with atomic power. The tragedy forced a top-to-bottom re-evaluation of how reactors were designed, built, and operated. From the ashes of this tragedy rose a new era of nuclear safety. The most important change was the implementation of what is known as the one-rod rule. This design principle ensures that no single control rod in any reactor can ever have enough power to cause an accident like the one at SL-1. Modern reactors are designed with so much redundancy that the failure or mishandling of one component cannot lead to a catastrophe. Training for operators became far more rigorous, and the importance of a strong safety culture, where workers are encouraged to report problems without fear of reprisal, became a cornerstone of the industry. Today, the SL-1 accident remains the only fatal reactor accident in the history of the United States. The site where the reactor once stood has been cleaned up, the debris buried, and the land returned to the desert. But the legacy of Richard Legg, John Burns, and Richard McKinley endures. Their sacrifice, as tragic as it was, led to fundamental changes that have made nuclear power safer for everyone. Their story is a tough but necessary reminder that progress often comes at a high price, and that the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs are the ones that teach us the hardest and most important lessons.